Living with your parents used to be an embarrassing thing, but nowadays I feel like it could be one of the smartest financial decisions you can make, especially in your 20s. But I do think it could also ruin your growth if you're not intentional. So today we're going to break down the truth here, the good, the bad, and the part that nobody talks about. Should you live with your parents in your 20s? Now, before we jump into the video, do you think living with your parents in your 20s is a smart move or is it a setback? Comment that down below. I'd love to hear. So jumping into the video, why does this topic even matter today? I personally feel like the stigma around living with your parents has changed a lot, even over the past 10 years. Like I feel like back in, 2012, 2015, if you were out of college and you're still living with your parents, it was probably pretty frowned upon compared to nowadays with how expensive everything is and with wages being pretty stagnant over the past couple of years. It makes a lot of sense. And I did want to preface this video by saying a lot of the stuff I'm saying in here is just my opinion. It is not fact. Do not take it personal. There's no right way of doing things. Again, this is just my take on it. I personally believe if you're in your early 20s and you're living with your parents, assuming you're doing it for the right reasons, and we'll go over that, then live at home with your parents. It's definitely a good move. But I do feel like once you get towards mid 20s, 24, 25, 26, you should be looking to move out, if not already moved out. And I personally think if you're still living with your parents in your late 20s, you got to kind of, step it up a little bit. And I'll kind of break down why I feel this way about these three different categories, or kind of these three different sections. Early 20s, definitely live with your parents. Mid 20s, let's start to transition out. Late 20s, I really don't think you should. But before we dive into all that, let's actually talk about the reality that a lot of 20-year-olds are facing right now. It is the fact that cost of living has gone up a ton, even over the past 5 years, but wages have not. I remember when I first got out of college, a lot of jobs were paying $20, $22, $25 an hour. Even nowadays, a lot of them are still paying that amount. So they have barely gone up in regards to wage growth. If you're fresh out of high school or college, you're probably not looking to buy a house, so you're going to rent. And for a lot of places, rent is still pretty high. And also, if you live alone and it is pretty expensive for you and you really don't have much money left over, then it could delay your wealth building by a couple of years. And so the opportunity cost of renting versus living at home with your parents can add up to be a lot of money. Like let's say that rent in your area is $1,500, $1,500 times 12, that's $18,000 a year you're saving if you stay at home with your parents, assuming they're not making you pay rent, of course. So let's actually talk about when is living with your parents a really smart move? And this is the strategic way of viewing it. I'm not here to shame people. I'm just here to say, I feel like there's a good way of going about this and there's a bad way of going about it. So when does living with your parents make the most sense? I would say the first condition that you want to meet is that you have a plan. So your plan is to not live with them forever. You want to, maybe save up a certain amount of money. Maybe you want to pay off a certain amount of debt, or maybe you just give yourself a timeline. Hey, I'm going to live with my parents for the next 3 years. I just got out of high school and I want to live with them until I'm 22. So I'll live, 4 years and then I'll leave. Or I just got out of college and you're 21 or 22 years old and you're like, you know what? I'm going to live with them until I'm 24 and then I'm going to move out. So having a plan is the first thing. If you don't have a plan, I feel like you don't want to just sit there and just linger around and not grow as a person. If you're living at home with your parents, you should be trying to grow as much as possible. The next thing is that you are aggressively investing or saving. In my opinion, if the cost of living at home with your parents is the exact same as you renting somewhere, I really don't see the reason to. Unless if your parents really take care of you in other aspects, like maybe they do all, laundry, dishes, they're cooking for you, stuff like that. But for the most part, if it's still going to cost you the same amount to live on your own versus living with your parents, probably want to live on your own there. So that goes back to the point. If you're living with your parents and they're not charging you any rent and you can save a ton of money and you can invest a ton of money, definitely take advantage of that. The third thing I would say is if you're going to live at home with your parents, assuming you have a good relationship with them, which I think is pretty important for this decision, obviously, I do feel like you should be contributing something. Now, I'm not saying you got to pay, a certain amount of their mortgage or pay rent or, pay for groceries, but try to chip in any way you can. Even if it is throwing $50, $100 here and there for groceries, maybe you're doing a lot of different chores, just try to help out if you can, because at the end of the day, the cost of living hits everybody, and that includes your parents or your family that you're going to live with. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing I would say is that you're trying to build skills that increase income. So let's say you just started your first job, you're making, let's say $25 an hour. That's a little over $50,000 a year. Try to learn different skills while you're living at home with your parents to increase your income. And that way, as you increase your income, it'll be a lot quicker to hit maybe a financial goal that you set when you're initially setting up that plan to live with your parents. And then the last thing I would say is you don't want to decline socially. So it is a power move to live with your parents if you're still hanging out with friends, if you're still networking, if you're still dating. If you're not doing all those things and you're just being a hermit, living with your parents might not be the best move for you. But also, I understand that living alone in this position could also be detrimental. So it really depends on that. But I would say if you're going to live at home with your parents, try not to completely isolate yourself. And that also goes for whether you live alone with your parents or without them. But try to just, stay social if you can. I feel like not being as social could definitely hit the confidence for a lot of people, especially guys. So try to just stay a little bit social. Even if you're not dating, just try to hang out with friends fairly often or have, some type of people that you can hang out with. That way it's not just you doing your parents 24/7? Because I'm sure in that position you'd get pretty sick of them. I know at least I would, that's for sure. So some of the benefits of living at home with your parents is you can easily save $10,000, $20,000 a year even if you're making, 40, 50K a year, which is not a ton, but not little. It's kind of, in the middle, I'd say. And that's assuming that they're not charging you rent. The next thing I would say, another benefit is that you can jumpstart your investments very early. If you're investing $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year and you're 19, 20, 22, you're absolutely killing it. You are way ahead of most people in your age. The next thing I would say is that it's going to reduce stress when you're building your career. I cannot imagine somebody stressing about being laid off and living at home with your parents, because if you don't have any expenses, it's not like you have bills to pay the next month, even if you do get laid off. So you don't really need to stress about building up your career early on. You can just focus on building those skills I was talking about. The next benefit that I see here is it allows you to build a real emergency fund because you don't have any overhead, you don't have any expenses, you're not paying water or electric or, rent, which is obviously the biggest expense, or groceries. You're not paying anything. So that will help you build up a pretty quick emergency fund, in my opinion. And normally I like to do between 3 to 6 months of expenses. Now, if you're living at home with your parents and you have no expenses, I would say just save up between 5 to 10K. Honestly, that's just like top of my head. That's what I would say for most people. It really does depend where you live though, because obviously 10K doesn't go as far in New York as it does in Iowa. But the next thing I would say is it gives you the opportunity to eliminate high interest debt very quickly, which is important because when you look at, student loans or credit cards or anything with an interest rate above, I don't know, I'd say 8, 10%, you want to pay that off as quickly as possible. And when you're living at home with your parents, this could be a total power move, especially just being able to eliminate that debt. And I'm sure that's probably a goal for a lot of people. So those are some examples of when living with your parents is a smart move. Now let's talk about when living with your parents is not a smart move. So the first thing I would say is that if you don't have a timeline or a plan, like you're just kind of winging it, you're living with them, just whatever, I don't really know where I'm going to go from here. I'm not saying you have to have your life all figured out, because you're in your early 20s. You're just trying to figure your shit out. But you should at least be trying. At least try to think of how can I progress and how can I get myself to a better position 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 3 years from now. What does that look like and what do I need to do to get there? The next thing I would say is if you're not saving any money, and I kind of talked about this in the last point, if you're not saving any money because you're spending it all and you're just being dumb with money, then I don't feel like living at home with your parents is really helping you much. And then on top of that, I would say if you're comfortable but you're not growing, at the end of the day, like I just said, you want to be growing as a person. And I already know for a lot of people living at home with your parents, even if you don't care about what people think, I do think because you're still somewhat reliant on your parents, it's hard to be 100% confident in yourself. At least for me, that's how I felt. And I only lived with my parents for a couple of months when I was like 23, but still for somebody that's living there for, a year, 2, 3 years, I could definitely see how it's hard to feel super confident in that position when you're still reliant and dependent on other people. So that's another thing. Try to keep growing. That is one of the key points I'm going to be saying multiple times in this video. The next thing I would also say is if your parents enable bad habits. Now, I can't think of many examples of this, but if your parents do not really help you or push you, maybe it's best to move out. It really depends on your dynamic with your parents. And there's a lot of nuance to this because everyone's relationship with their parents is a lot different. But if you feel like your parents are not healthy to be around long term, get the fuck out of there as soon as possible. I mean, that's just kind of a given, I think. And then the last thing I would say is that if you use it as an excuse to avoid responsibility, if you're going to live at home with your parents, like I said before, try to help them out, try to have a plan, and try to grow and improve over, 1, 2, 3 years, however long you live with them. If you're just sitting around doing nothing, you're not applying to any jobs, you're not trying to get better at all, I feel like you're just using it as an excuse to avoid responsibility, and you don't want to do that. Because again, going back to the confidence thing, it's hard to feel good about yourself if you're not, I don't want to say progressing, but if you're just not doing anything. So if all of these things are occurring, or if any of them are, and you feel like, you don't have a timeline or a plan, you're not saving anything, you're super comfortable, you're enabling bad habits, or your parents are enabling bad habits, then this could really slow down your career progression. You could see a lot of social isolation, like what I was talking about. There's also a delayed level of independence because if you're just sitting around with no plan, before you know it, you're going to be 28, 29, 30s in the exact same position. And the key thing I would take away here is that living with your parents, it only works when you treat it like a launch pad, because it truly can be. You can set yourself up for total victory. But if you view living with your parents as like the landing zone where you're just going to chill and do nothing and not really try to grow at all, I don't see how it could be beneficial, at least medium to long term. Maybe it's fine for the first couple months, but I just can't see how that would be good long term. So how do you actually live with your parents the right way? So the first thing I would say is set a clear timeline. So like I said before, set a goal where it's like, I'm going to move out within 2 years, or I'm going to live here for a year and try to save up as much money as possible. So just try to have some type of a timeline. And this could also be backed by a goal. So maybe it's like, hey, I want to save up $20,000 before I move out, or maybe I want to pay down $8,000 of debt, or I want to build a 6-month emergency fund, or maybe you're already investing. You already have an emergency fund, you've already paid down debt, and you want to hit, let's say, $20,000 invested, and then you'll start to look to move out. So set a clear timeline, try to have some type of financial goal, because that to me is the main reason most people would live at home with their parents, is because you can save a lot of money. The next thing I would say is definitely contribute something. So whether it's paying them a couple $100s in rent, maybe you buy groceries, maybe you step it up and handle a lot more chores than you normally do. If your parents are kind enough to let you live with them in your early 20s, because a lot of parents don't. There are a lot of people out there where the second they hit 18, their parents are like, get the fuck out of my house. Like, do not stay here. So if your parents are kind enough to let you live with them, the least you can do is contribute something. And I do feel like if you're contributing something, it's going to avoid a lot of conflict, hopefully, because it's not like you're being a bum. Like, you're still helping out with rent, or, you're helping out with groceries. You're just trying to help out while you're there. The next thing I would say is try to make sure you are maintaining independence. So still, like, do your own laundry, occasionally cook your own meals, or have your own routines or social life, whether that's hanging out with some friends, or maybe you do, I don't know, a run club, or you're going to work out with a buddy, or whatever that looks like for you. Like, try to have still somewhat of a social life if you can. And then the last thing I would say is use this time here to build up your earning power. Like I said before, try to learn new skills to build up your career, or maybe you start a side hustle, or you start investing and you start building a portfolio. You want to be very intentional about living with your parents. And that is the key word here, is to be as intentional as possible. So I feel like that's how you can live with your parents the right way. Now, when is it actually time to move out? Like, how do you know when you're ready? I feel like you're ready when you can comfortably afford rent, savings, investing, if you can do all three. If you want more independence and you're like, you know what, I've been with them for 2 years, I'm making $70K, I'm 24, 25 years old, I'm good now. Like, even after rent, and even, I don't have a car payment anymore because I paid it off while living at home with my parents. If you're at a point where you just want more independence, then definitely it is time to move out. The next thing I would say is if your career is stable. So if you just lost your job, probably not a good time to move out of the parents' house. But if you've had the job for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, maybe you've gotten promoted one time, you really like the company you're working for, everything seems pretty stable, there's not mass layoffs going on, maybe it's time to move out there. The next thing I would say is once you've hit your financial goal, I know that's kind of a given. And one of the last points I want to make is make sure that you move out when you're ready. Do not move out just to avoid judgment of other people, because at the end of the day, you really should not care about what other people think. Just focus on you and doing what is best for you. But I do feel like after a certain age, once you're in your late 20s, 27, 28, 29, it's kind of time to grow up. And I'm not saying that to be an asshole. I just think that's the honest truth. And I also feel like there's a sense of confidence that comes with being able to take care of yourself. And I remember experiencing this when I first moved. When I was 23 years old, I moved halfway across the country. My parents were like, hey, we can't pay for your health insurance. We can't pay for anything anymore. Like, it's all on you, buddy. And I remember those first couple weeks I moved into my apartment, I was stressed the fuck out. I was like, how do I pay for health insurance? Like, I had previously paid for rent and utilities, so I knew that part I'd be fine. But it was more like, how do I pay for my dental insurance and health insurance? And how do I do all these different things that I've never done before? And the main way I did that was just by focusing on one thing at a time. It's very overwhelming when you first move out, but once you figure out, okay, my health insurance is coming out of my paychecks, and then, okay, I have my car payment once every 6 months for my insurance, and then I have my monthly car payment. Once you kind of get in the routine and you start to see all these different expenses and you truly are paying for all of them yourself, it will give you a sense of complete confidence. I really do feel that way because you're not relying on anybody. I remember when I was 23, after a couple of months of, moving out, starting to take care of myself, I remember thinking to myself, damn, like, this is kind of a morbid thought, but if both of my parents died right now, I'd be okay because I'm not fully dependent on them. Like, I'm still saving money every month. I'm still paying bills. And at the time I was saving up to buy my first house, and I wasn't making a ton of money. I was making $55K a year, which was pretty normal. Nothing super low, but nothing high either. I wouldn't say that's a lot of money by any means. And so I do feel like you should not care about what other people think, but I do think after a while, it is what is best for you. And what is best for you, I feel like, is trying to grow, trying to improve, trying to just make as much, money as possible, trying to just have a lot of stability in your life. And when you're not dependent on other people, your confidence will rise so much. I'm telling you guys, give yourself a couple of months after you move out, and once you're fully taking care of yourself, you're like, shit, I can do this. Like, I'm being an adult now. This is sick. At least that was my take. And also, one point I did want to make is when it comes to dating when you're living with your parents, I think in your early 20s, probably not a big deal. Most girls, I would say, don't give a shit. But if you're like 28 and you're talking to girls and you're like, hey, want to come back to my place? I live with my parents. Most girls, not all of them, but most girls are going to be pretty turned off to that idea. Like, they want a guy that has a sense of direction, stability, that's really trying to get themselves to a good place. And if you graduated college and you're 22 years old, now you're 28, you've kind of had 6 years at this point to figure it out. And if you didn't even go to college and you graduated at 18, you've had 10 years. So that's just my personal opinion here. I know that might be a little controversial, but again, just my opinion, not a fact. And so my final thoughts on this is that if you live at home, you're not a failure. Do not view yourself like that. It can be an absolute cheat code if you use it properly. And I got to be honest, one thing I regret is not not living with my parents right out of college because I would have saved up so much money then, and I feel like I definitely would have had a lot more stability. And the reality is, if people are roasting you for living at home with your parents and you're 22, 23, 21 years old, like, don't take that from them. At the end of the day, they're probably just jealous because you're saving a shit ton of money. That's the reality of it, because they're over here paying $2,000 a month in rent. You're not paying anything. So the truth here is that where you live matters a lot less than what you do while you're there. That is the most important part. So that is my take on whether you should live with your parents in your 20s or not. Comment that down below. What do you feel like it's a setback? Do you feel like it's a good thing? I'd love to hear. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, drop a like down below, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.